Hello, my name is Tim Germain. In this presentation, In Search of the Biblical Church, we'll be contrasting the differences between the institutional church that follows man-made traditions and the biblical church that we find within the pages of the New Testament. It's been a journey for me for a number of years, and I trust that it'll be an education as well as an eye-opener as we look together into the Scriptures, that we might truly understand what is the church that Jesus is building today.
I honor you to invite you in our midst, so that you do what you want to do in our midst. I love you, I bless you.
When you mention the word church today, most people think of a large building that you walk into on a Sunday. You're greeted by an usher who gives you a program and describes the events from beginning to end. You're then seated in some pews on both sides or in a large amphitheater, and you listen to one man give a message on a podium or an altar. This is the common understanding of what going to church means to most people.
Well, the buildings where people go to church are called by different names. Here in our town, we have the Baptist Church, the United Church, the Presbyterian Church, the Reformed Church. Used to have an Anglican church. Everybody has their own name, the denomination they're comfortable with, and that's where people go to church. Inside these buildings, we have leaders, men and women who do most of the speaking and teaching. They go by various names. Years ago, I was one of these. I went by the term pastor, reverend. Others go by father, bishop.
In most churches, you've got an agreement with the government. And the agreement is that the church will collect money and the government will provide charitable tax status. So to sum up, we've got these buildings where there are activities being run. The activities are being run by, for the most part, paid professionals. The people sitting in the pews, for the most part, are expected to be silent. It is run by a program. There's something that's very controlled about this, something that's artificial about it. The expectation that an offering will be taken. This offering keeps the program running. It pays for the professionals.
And sometimes there would be a special meeting just to eat a small cracker and also drink a small cup of juice. We started off with a statement which is in search of the biblical church. But actually what we see today is almost nothing like what is described in the Bible. Isn't that an amazing statement?
We actually see 4 things that were true of all the churches that we see in the New Testament. But firstly, when it comes to what you will call church government, we see that in the churches in the New Testament, they governed themselves through the simple process of everyone in the church seeking the Lord's will and together coming to agreement about what the Lord was saying. Now, they had leaders. These leaders were referred to as elders or pastors or bishops, all different words for the same people. But these guys, they weren't in charge. I mean, they shared in decision-making. They were part of the church. But they weren't in charge. But what they were the mature brothers who were further on with the Lord than anyone else. And they acted as guides. They acted as father figures. They were advisory as opposed to being executive. And these leaders were always recognised from within the church that they were going to lead. So that's the first thing that we see. That when it comes to church government, we have a leadership that is locally raised up and it's advisory, like their authority was simply moral authority, not positional authority. But the decisions were always made by the collective body of believers in the church. So this is the first thing that we see of church life in the New Testament.
I went to Bible school, and one of our courses was on the pastoral epistles, 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus. And we looked at, in 1 Timothy 3 and Titus chapter 1, at the qualifications of elders and deacons. And I thought back to times when our church had been without a pastor, and the pastoral search committee was looking for candidates to present to the church as possible candidates to be our next pastor. And thinking back to those times, I couldn't recall once when the church had been encouraged to consider the qualifications in 1 Timothy 3 or Titus 1. We were looking at the man's education, his abilities, his degrees, his seminary training. Was he good in music? Was he good with young people? Was he good administrator? But looking at the pastoral epistles, none of those things were mentioned as qualifications for church leaders. In fact, only one ability was mentioned there, and that was he needs to be able to teach. But all of the rest of the qualifications had to do with what kind of man is he? What kind of a man is he with his family? Does he have his children under control? Does he have a good testimony in the community? What's his reputation like? Is he a man given to anger or striking? And so as I compared what Scripture said and what we were looking for as qualifications for church leaders, I began to see there was a big divergence between the two. But eventually I myself became an ordained minister. My wife and I went as missionaries to the West Indies. I understood we were going as New Testament church planters, planting churches that would function according to the New Testament. And while we were there, our mission board planned a conference of all of our missionaries in the Caribbean to consider the matter of church planting. I was the youngest missionary there, and they asked me for some reason to chair the panel discussion on the subject of church planting. And I thought, I'd better do some studying, I'd better do some homework. So I went to a Christian bookstore and looked for books on church planting. At that time, in that particular little store, I couldn't find any. And so I got thinking, well, really, where's the best place to go but the book of Acts, where the whole thing got started? And so I just started reading the book of Acts, reading it over and over again, evaluating the ministries of the different apostles, the cities they visited, how they conducted their ministry, what the results were, and then comparing the results of these men as they went to these different cities. And I began to realize that many things that we were doing in our ordinary churches and what I was training the national believers to do, I couldn't find them in Scripture. And one thing that really began to trouble me, as I read through the book of Acts repeatedly, I couldn't find one church in all the New Testament that had one man like myself as the pastor. Couldn't find any New Testament church with one man as the leader. I discovered that every New Testament church was eventually guided by a number of elders, a plurality of elders.
Now, the second aspect of the design that we see, again, Steve has already pointed us to it, is quite simply the fact that churches met in houses. It is always, without exception, in somebody's house. So this immediately tells us as well that churches were numerically small, because a house limits the size of the number of people you can get in it. So we see that churches met in houses and that each church was numerically small. So the design that we see in the Bible is to have lots and lots and lots of little churches, as opposed to having a smaller number of numerically big churches. So that's the second aspect of the design, house-based and therefore numerically small.